Good afternoon. I'm Merrick Masters, and welcome to Nixon's the One, 1968 in America. Today is July 3rd, 2024, and this is episode 3 of this video documentary series. The focus today is on LBJ shocks the nation and withdraws from the presidential race. His withdrawal statement was made on March 31st, 1968, in a Sunday night address to the nation. On my playlist, you can find an excerpt from LBJ's speech addressing the nation on January the 17th, 1968, in which he gave his State of the Union address before the Congress. At that time, LBJ appeared relatively subdued and was cautious about what he said regarding Vietnam and his domestic agenda. What was not known at that time was that Johnson thought that he had brought with him a statement to announce his withdrawal from the presidency. A week after Johnson's State of the Union address, the United States received disappointing news in that North Korea had captured the USS Pueblo on international waters, what we considered international waters, and what North Korea claimed to be its own territorial rights. There were 75 enlisted men, 6 officers, and 2 civilians aboard that ship. As I mentioned, LBJ had thought that he had brought a withdrawal statement with him, and he had actually been considering withdrawing from the race in 1968 as far back as 1965, according to reports, and had intense discussions with some of his friends about that in 1967, the latter part of 1967, including discussions with the governor of Texas at that time, John Connally, who was a close associate of LBJ. LBJ apparently reached into his pocket during the State of the Union address looking for that withdrawal statement, but it was not there. He had forgot that he had left it on his bedroom table at the White House. Since then, he was waiting for an appropriate moment to announce withdrawal. He was concerned that a withdrawal statement would render him a weakened president as a result of his lame duck status. And he had a lot on his agenda that he wanted to accomplish. Another important development occurred during this time period, and that was the Tet Offensive, which was launched on January 30th or 31st, 1968, in which the North Vietnamese, with their Viet Cong allies, assaulted over 100 cities in South Vietnam and stripped away the illusion that we were on the verge of winning the war in Vietnam. Also, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, at the end of February, served his last day as Secretary of Defense, and there was a ceremony held toward that time to celebrate his tenure. Actually, LBJ had forced McNamara out because he was dissenting with his policy on the Vietnam War, and some believe that McNamara was somewhat mentally unstable or very challenged at that time because of his emotionalism associated with policy in Vietnam. He had been closely associated with the escalation in military action, but had since become a bit of a dove on that important national question. To replace Secretary McNamara, Johnson selected one of his longtime friends, Clark Clifford, who was a practicing attorney. Clifford had worked in the Truman administration and was instrumental in Truman's 1948 election victory, which surprised everybody, in which he defeated Tom Dewey for the presidency. Clifford was thought by many to be a hawk on Vietnam and came in with rather hawkish views, but he quickly changed his position and became a dove and started to look for ways to end American involvement, realizing in his mind that the U.S. could not win a military victory in South Vietnam. Clifford's timeline, as reported in his book, which he wrote about his association with various presidents and his counsel to them, both as a staff member and as an outside counsel, is provided in this brief timeline. He was nominated on January the 19th for Secretary of Defense, 1968. The Pueblo was captured on January the 23rd, as I mentioned earlier. The Tet Offensive occurred on January 30th, 1968. It was a very distressing time nationally as a result of these incidents. On February 27th, General Wheeler had requested almost 206,000 additional troops to keep in reserve to deploy in Vietnam. We already had over 500,000 troops in South Vietnam at that time. On March the 1st, Secretary Clifford was sworn in as Secretary of Defense. On March the 17th, LBJ gave a tough speech on Vietnam, and behind the scenes at the White House, people were circulating various drafts of a speech that Johnson planned to give to the nation on March the 31st, 1968. LBJ, shortly before he gave that speech, on March 27, 1968, got an alternative version, which was written by someone on his staff closer to the dovish side of the position on Vietnam, that focused on peace rather than war or an escalation in military engagement on the part of the U.S. On March 31st, 1968, LBJ gave a speech to the nation that Sunday night. He surprised the nation by not only announcing that he would have a substantial cessation of bombing in North Vietnam, but not a complete cessation of bombing, and also that he would withdraw as a candidate for the presidency in the interest of focusing on peace. The U.S. military, was reported by the New York Times on March the 10th, had requested 206,000 additional troops to keep in reserve to deploy to Vietnam on an as-needed basis during 1968. This, as I mentioned in the previous slide, was recommended by General Wheeler at the end of February, but was not known to the general public until it was reported in the New York Times. And this created a rising level of dissension about the U.S. engagement. With 500,000 troops already in Vietnam, the thought of an additional 210,000, or nearly that many, had an alarming effect on the public's appreciation or lack thereof of our military engagement plans at that time. As a result of the Tet Offensive and other adverse news in the Vietnam War, Johnson's approval rating plummeted in the 2 months between early January and mid-March. His approval rating dropped from 48% to 36%, and his disapproval rating climbed from 39% to 52%. This clearly was a factor in his calculation about whether he should seek re-election. Also, on March the 12th, Eugene McCarthy had performed very well, winning 42% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary to Johnson's 49%. Johnson was a write-in candidate, although he won nominally the Democratic primary in New Hampshire. He had failed to meet expectations, and that was cause for Robert Kennedy to reconsider his position with regard to whether he wanted to run for the presidency, and he did run for the presidency. You can see, if you look at this video on him, which is on my playlist, as are other videos of various scenes from this time period in my YouTube channel, Merrick Masters. You can see Robert Kennedy announcing his candidacy for the presidency, there was a special news report that was held that day on March the 16th, 1968, in which he declared his candidacy. That's how significant the news was at the time. Johnson met with Vice President Humphrey at his apartment on March 31st, 1968. He had kept it very close to his vest what his plans were with regard to withdrawing as a candidate for the presidency. He met with Humphrey. He swore him to secrecy. Humphrey was on his way to Mexico that day to conduct business and international affairs. And Humphrey was very distraught over hearing that Johnson would withdraw. Johnson told him that if Humphrey wanted to be president and was thinking about running in 1968, he'd better get started quickly. There's a video of Johnson practicing the speech before he delivered it on that Sunday, March the 31st. It's very interesting to see how he goes through it line by line and talks about his reactions to some of the statements in the speech. And it provides insight as to how the speech was written. He at times wonders about some of the language in the speech that he thinks was slipped in by the State Department that he says doesn't make any sense to people, and wondering why anybody would say such things. But it's an intimate view of Johnson as he's rehearsing for the speech, and I think it is remarkable in showing the vigor with which he went through it and the seriousness with which he took his activities at that particular point in time. Johnson, although there have been reports that he had an abominable behavioral traits, and clearly could be a very aggressive and abusive person in terms of how he related to people, was careful and thoughtful about how he made decisions and took positions that he held very, very seriously. Johnson addressed the nation on March the 31st, 1968, and announced that he was stopping the bombing in roughly 90% of North Vietnam and only using it slightly above the demilitarized zone to prevent the influx of North Vietnamese troops and military hardware into South Vietnam, which would threaten American lives. Nixon was flying into New York City, LaGuardia Airport, and he was met at the airport on that Sunday evening. He had been returning from Milwaukee, where he was campaigning in the upcoming April 2nd, that was Tuesday after Johnson's speech, Wisconsin primary. Nixon had won the Republican primary on March the 12th in New Hampshire and was the favorite to win in Wisconsin. The only question was by how much he would win. And Buchanan ran onto the plane, which you could do at that period of time without having to go through security, and told Nixon that Johnson had withdrawn from the race and stopped the bombing over most of North Vietnam. Nixon went out, greeted the press, and said, "This is the year of the dropouts. First Romney, who had withdrawn for the presidency or the presidential race at the end of February. Then Rockefeller, who on March the 21st had said he would not be a candidate for the Republican nomination. And now Johnson, who had withdrawn on March the 31st. According to Pat Buchanan in his book on Richard Nixon's comeback, in 1968, Nixon regretted the apparent flippancy of his remark, but it is on the record. There were lots of other things going on at the same time in the area of civil rights, which was gathering storm. Martin Luther King was participating in support of a strike of sanitation workers in Memphis, which was quite heated and confrontational. And he had been there to register his support for the sanitation workers, who were overwhelmingly African American, and they were protesting unacceptable working conditions. The civil rights movement was undergoing a transformation at that time, arguably becoming more militant. And the People's March on Washington, which was to take place in the summer, was in its early stages as protesters across the nation gathered to march to D.C. to occupy the city to protest the conditions of poverty in the United States. King had become increasingly militant during this time period in his opposition to the war and also in his concern about the lack of urgency with which the United States had responded to the Kerner Commission, which criticized the society in the United States for having grown into two unequal parts that discriminated against African Americans in particular. He wanted more rapid response to address the economic and political issues and injustices facing African Americans, and was using his leverage as a national leader to exert that influence. I hope you've enjoyed this episode 3, focusing on LBJ's withdrawal. Episode 4 focuses on another tragedy which occurred in American society in 1968, and that is the assassination of Martin Luther King, which took place on April the 4th, 1968, just a few days after Johnson's withdrawal speech, and had significant repercussions in terms of the uprising it caused in various communities about the assassination and the concern that it provoked in the presidential campaign about law and order society and how to address issues associated with unrest and rebellion. I'm Eric Masters. I hope you will watch this episode and click subscribe on my YouTube channel and click like if you want to see more of these types of episodes. I'm producing more in the series of Nixon's the One between now and Election Day of 2024 on November the 5th to provide you with a historical perspective on one of the most controversial years in American politics. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking with you again. Take care and have a good day.